In 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian merchant named Marco Polo left Venice with his father and his uncle and traveled east. He would not return for 24 years. In that time, he would travel approximately 15,000 miles, visit the courts of Kublai Khan in Khanbalik, the city that is now Beijing, serve the Khan as an official for 17 years, and return to Venice with accounts of a world so different from anything Europeans had previously encountered that, when he dictated his memoirs to a Romance writer named Rustichello of Pisa, his contemporaries assumed he was lying. He described cities of 1 million people when European cities rarely exceeded 50,000. He described paper money when Europeans had never seen it. He described coal being burned for fuel when Europeans burned wood. He described postal relay systems, enormous fleets, administrative sophistication on a scale that had no European equivalent. What Marco Polo was describing, and what Europeans were almost entirely unable to believe, was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The period between approximately 1250 and 1350, during which the Mongol Empire, which at its maximum extent stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Danube River in Eastern Europe, maintained a degree of political unity, physical security, and commercial connectivity across the Eurasian landmass that had never existed before and would not exist again for centuries. The Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China and Central Asia and Persia and the Mediterranean that had carried goods and ideas across Eurasia for 15 centuries, had never functioned so well, so safely, or so profitably as it did under Mongol rule. The Pax Mongolica was the world's first global economy, or at least its first Eurasian-spanning one, and the Mongols built it partly by accident, partly by design, and partly by virtue of the specific political achievement of unifying the steppe, the vast grassland corridor stretching from Manchuria to Hungary, under a single political authority for the first time in history. And then they destroyed it, not deliberately, not by any single decision, but through the specific mechanism of the Black Death, the pandemic of bubonic plague that swept from Central Asia across the Mongol trade routes into the Middle East and Europe beginning in the late 1340s, and through the political fragmentation of the Mongol Empire itself, which had begun to break apart into competing successor states decades before the plague arrived. The economy that the Mongols built was destroyed by the very connectivity that made it possible. The trade routes that carried silk and spices and porcelain also carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. The Pax Mongolica died of its own success. What historians get wrong about the Mongols is almost everything. The standard account, in Western historiography especially, presents the Mongols primarily as destroyers, as the horsemen of the apocalypse who descended from the steppe and laid waste to the civilizations of Central Asia, Persia, China, and Eastern Europe. The destruction was real. The Mongol conquests killed, by most estimates, between 30 and 40 million people, approximately 10% of the world's population at the time, a proportion comparable to the Second World War. The cities of Samarkand and Merv, and Nishapur and Baghdad were reduced to rubble. The irrigation systems of Persia and Mesopotamia that had supported agricultural civilization for millennia were destroyed and never fully restored. The scale of destruction was genuinely catastrophic, but the destruction was the prelude to the construction. The Mongol Empire that emerged from the conquests of Genghis Khan and his successors was not simply a military phenomenon. It was a political phenomenon, of extraordinary sophistication, a system for governing the largest contiguous land empire in history that included mechanisms for trade promotion, postal communication, religious tolerance, and commercial law that made the Pax Mongolica possible. Understanding the Mongols requires understanding both dimensions simultaneously: the catastrophic violence of the conquests and the extraordinary commercial and cultural connectivity of what followed. To understand how the Mongols built the world's first global economy, you have to begin not with Genghis Khan, but with the steppe itself. The Eurasian steppe is a corridor of grassland, approximately 8,000 kilometers long and several hundred kilometers wide, stretching from Manchuria in the east to the Hungarian plain in the west. It is the central geographic fact of Eurasian history, the pathway through which peoples and armies and diseases and ideas have moved across the continent for 10,000 years. But the steppe is also a military and political problem. The peoples who inhabited the steppe, the nomadic pastoralists who herded horses and cattle and sheep across its vast distances, were among the most effective cavalry forces in the world. They were mobile, resilient, skilled at horse archery, and capable of projecting military force over distances that agricultural states found impossible to match. The relationship between the steppe nomads and the agricultural civilizations that surrounded them, China to the east and south, Persia and the Islamic world to the southwest, the Christian states of Europe to the west, was characterized by chronic tension and periodic catastrophe. The nomads raided the agricultural states. The agricultural states built walls, literally in China's case, and paid tribute and tried to buy peace. No agricultural state had ever managed to conquer and unify the steppe, because the steppe's geography defeated conventional military strategy. You could not hold the steppe. You could only move across it. What Genghis Khan achieved, and it was an achievement of extraordinary political and military genius, was to unify the steppe from the inside. He did not conquer the steppe from a base in an agricultural civilization. He conquered it from within, using the military techniques of the nomads themselves, combined with political innovations that transformed the clan-based tribal society of the Mongolian plateau into something more cohesive and more durable. He abolished the traditional clan structure and replaced it with a system of decimal military organization, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, that cut across clan lines and created loyalty to himself and to the Mongol state rather than to clan leaders. He promoted men on the basis of merit and loyalty rather than birth. He created a code of law, the yasa, that provided a basic framework of rules for the unified Mongol state. The result was an army of extraordinary effectiveness, mobile, disciplined, psychologically devastating, capable of coordinating complex military operations across vast distances, and motivated by a combination of loyalty to Genghis Khan personally and the prospect of the enormous wealth that successful conquest would produce. The Mongol army was not simply a military force. It was an economic enterprise. Conquest was the mechanism through which wealth was generated and distributed. The system of plunder and tribute that conquest produced was the economic foundation of the Mongol political order. The conquests that Genghis Khan began, of the Yurshan Jin dynasty in northern China, of the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia and Persia, and that his successors completed, of the rest of China under the Song dynasty, of Persia and Iraq, of the Korean Peninsula, of Russia, and Poland and Hungary, produced the empire that would become the platform for the Pax Mongolica. The empire at its maximum extent, in the 1270s, stretched from Korea and southern China in the east to Poland and Hungary in the west, from Siberia in the north to Persia and Iraq in the south. It was larger than any empire that had preceded it and has not been equaled in contiguous land area since. What made this empire economically significant? What made it the foundation of the world's first global economy, rather than simply the largest land empire in history, was the specific political and institutional choices that the Mongol rulers made after the conquests were completed. The most important of these choices was the decision to promote trade rather than simply to extract tribute. The Mongol approach to trade was distinctive in several respects. Merchants, or Ortak merchants as they were called, the licensed commercial agents of the Mongol ruling class, were given protection, legal standing, and specific commercial privileges within the empire. The Mongol rulers themselves invested in trading caravans, providing capital to merchants in exchange for a share of the profits. The postal relay system, the YAM, provided not just military communication, but commercial communication, allowing merchants to move goods and information across the empire with a speed that had no precedent. The Mongol system of commercial law, enforced across the empire regardless of the specific legal traditions of the conquered peoples, provided the contractual predictability that long-distance trade required. The specific mechanism through which the Pax Mongolica worked was the security of the overland routes. Before the Mongol unification, the Silk Road routes that connected China and Central Asia and Persia and the Mediterranean were subject to the specific political fragmentation that characterized the pre-Mongol Eurasian world, to the competing demands of the multiple states that controlled different sections of the route, to the banditry that political fragmentation enabled, and to the periodic disruption of trade by the wars that broke out between adjacent states along the route. The Mongol unification removed all of these obstacles simultaneously. A merchant traveling from China to Persia in the 1270s crossed the territory of a single political authority. He paid taxes once rather than many times. He traveled under the protection of the Mongol state rather than negotiating his safety with multiple local powers. The result was a dramatic increase in the volume and the velocity of trade across the Eurasian landmass. Chinese silk and porcelain moved westward. Persian and Central Asian textiles and glassware moved eastward. Indian spices flowed through the Persian Gulf and Central Asian routes. European silver, for which there was strong demand in China, moved eastward in exchange for Chinese goods. The monetary economy expanded. New commercial techniques, bills of exchange, credit instruments, partnership arrangements, were developed to manage the financial complexity of long-distance trade on a scale that had not previously existed. The scale of this commercial expansion can be measured in several ways. The prices of luxury goods in European markets fell significantly in the 13th century, as Mongol facilitated trade expanded the supply of Asian goods reaching Mediterranean markets. The number of European merchants traveling to Asia, of which Marco Polo is the most famous, but not the only example, increased dramatically. The Venetian and Genoese merchants who had established trading communities in the Black Sea region found themselves with access to the entire Mongol trading network. The information that returned to Europe with these merchants about Chinese manufacturing techniques, about the compass and gunpowder and other Chinese technological achievements, about the geography of Asia, was transformative for European intellectual and commercial life. The spread of technology along the Mongol trade routes is one of the most significant and most underemphasized dimensions of the Pax Mongolica's legacy. Gunpowder, invented in China for fireworks and incendiary applications, reached the Islamic world, and then Europe, through the Mongol Empire and its trade networks. The compass reached Europe through the same routes: printing. The block printing that the Chinese had developed and that would eventually contribute to the development of movable type printing in Europe was carried westward by the Mongol commercial networks. Paper money, which the Mongols had adopted from Chinese practice and applied across their empire, introduced Europeans to concepts of credit and monetary substitution that would shape the development of European finance in the following centuries. The cultural exchange facilitated by the Pax Mongolica was equally extraordinary. The Mongols were religiously tolerant, not out of liberal principle, but out of pragmatic calculation. They governed peoples of every religious tradition: Buddhists, Confucians, Muslims, Christians, Jews, shamanists. And they found it more efficient to allow religious practice than to attempt the impossible task of religious homogenization. The result was a degree of cross-religious and cross-cultural contact along the Mongol routes that was unprecedented in Eurasian history. Christian missionaries traveled to the court of the Khan. Muslim scholars served Mongol rulers. Buddhist monks moved freely across the empire. The cosmopolitanism of the Pax Mongolica cities, Khanbalik, Samarkand, Tabriz, was a direct product of the Mongol political achievement. The fragmentation of the empire began almost immediately after its maximum extent was achieved. The fundamental problem was succession. Genghis Khan's system of dividing the empire among his descendants, with different branches of the family, ruling different portions of the empire as nominally united under the Supreme Khan, worked adequately while the conquests were still proceeding and the system was generating new wealth to distribute. Once the conquests slowed, once the empire had reached the limits of its military reach, with its failures in Japan, in Java, in Vietnam, in Egypt, demonstrating that the Mongol military system was not effective everywhere, the internal competition for resources and power intensified. The four major successor states, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and Iraq, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia, were nominally part of a single empire, but were functionally independent and frequently at war with each other by the late 13th century. The internal wars among the successor states disrupted the trade routes that the Pax Mongolica had unified. Merchants who had traveled freely across a single political authority now had to negotiate multiple borders, multiple tax systems, and the specific risks of traveling through zones of active military conflict. The commercial integration that the Mongol unification had produced began to unravel as the political integration that had made it possible disintegrated. Then came the plague. The Black Death, Yersinia pestis, is believed to have originated in rodent populations in Central Asia, where it had been present as an endemic disease for centuries. The specific mechanism by which it transitioned from endemic disease in rodent reservoirs to pandemic disease killing approximately 1/3 of the population of Europe, the Middle East, and large portions of Asia between 1347 and 1353, is still debated by historians and epidemiologists. The most widely accepted account holds that the plague spread along the Mongol trade routes, that the same commercial connectivity that had made the Pax Mongolica an extraordinary engine of economic exchange also made it an extraordinary engine of disease transmission. The specific documented origin point is the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading city on the Crimean Peninsula in 1346. A Mongol army of the Golden Horde was besieging the city when plague broke out among the Mongol forces. According to the account of the Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, who claim to have been present, though this is disputed. The Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa into the besieged city, in what would be the first documented use of biological warfare. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa, infected and fleeing, carried the plague by ship to Constantinople, and then to Sicily and Genoa in 1347. From there it spread across Europe with a speed that reflected both the biological virulence of the pathogen and the commercial connectivity that the Pax Mongolica had done so much to develop. The plague's demographic impact was catastrophic. Europe lost approximately one-third of its population between 1347 and 1353. The Middle East, which experienced the epidemic simultaneously, lost comparable proportions. China, where the plague may have originated and where it had been ravaging the population in the 1330s and 1340s, contributing to the famines and rebellions that would ultimately overthrow Mongol rule, lost perhaps 30 to 50% of its population. The demographic shock was the largest in recorded history, exceeding even the impact of the Mongol conquests themselves. The economic consequences of the Black Death were as profound as the demographic ones. The labor shortage created by massive population loss drove up wages for surviving workers across Europe and the Middle East. The commercial networks that had been built on the labor and purchasing power of the pre-plague population were disrupted. Trade volumes fell. Cities contracted. The agricultural systems that had supported the pre-plague population were reorganized around a smaller workforce. The entire economic geography of the post-plague world was different from the pre-plague world. In China, the plague and its associated famines and rebellions contributed directly to the overthrow of the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368, when the Chinese rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang founded the Ming dynasty and expelled the Mongols from China. The Ming dynasty, traumatized by the specific experience of Mongol rule and by the catastrophic demographic losses of the preceding decades, initially pursued a policy of commercial restriction and inward orientation that was the opposite of the outward-oriented commercial policies of the Mongol period. The great Chinese maritime expeditions of the early 15th century, the voyages of Zheng He, which reached Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa, represented a brief revival of Chinese maritime engagement with the world that was then deliberately ended by Ming court policy, a decision that left the field of global maritime trade to the Portuguese and Spanish explorers, who were beginning their own expansion at precisely the moment China was retreating from its own. The specific connection between the Mongol period and the subsequent European age of exploration is one of the most interesting and most underappreciated dimensions of Mongol legacy. The commercial geography that European merchants learned during the Pax Mongolica, the specific knowledge of Asian trade goods, of the routes by which they reached European markets, and of the extraordinary wealth that Asian trade could generate, created the demand for alternative routes to Asia that motivated the Portuguese exploration of the African coast and Columbus's westward voyage. The desire to find a sea route to China and India that bypassed the overland routes that the collapse of the Pax Mongolica had disrupted was a direct driver of the European geographical revolution of the late 15th century. In this sense, the Mongol Empire is one of the most important causes of European global expansion, and therefore, of the specific shape of the modern world, even though the Mongol Empire itself had ceased to exist by the time the European explorations began. The Mongol legacy is simultaneously the most destructive and the most creative in the history of pre-modern globalization. The Mongols killed tens of millions of people in their conquests, destroyed cities and irrigation systems that were never rebuilt, and disrupted agricultural civilizations that took centuries to recover. They also created the first genuinely Eurasian-spanning commercial and cultural network, transmitted technologies and ideas across the continent in ways that transformed every civilization they touched, facilitated the cross-cultural exchange that enriched every tradition that participated in the Pax Mongolica, and inadvertently provided the conditions for the European age of exploration by creating both the commercial knowledge that made Asia's wealth visible and the disruption that made alternative routes to that wealth desirable. The Black Death that the Mongol trade routes carried was not simply a biological event. It was the consequence of the specific kind of global connectivity that the Mongols had built. The plague needed the trade routes. The trade routes needed the Mongol political achievement. The Mongol political achievement needed the conquest and the steppe unification. The specific causal chain that runs from the unification of the Mongolian plateau by Genghis Khan in 1206 to the arrival of plague ships in Sicilian harbors in 1347 is one of the most consequential causal chains in the history of the world, producing at one end the world's first global economy, and at the other end, the demographic catastrophe that destroyed it. What historians get wrong about the Mongols is not the facts of their violence, which are well documented and undeniable. What they get wrong is the framework. The standard Western historiography of the Mongols is organized around the destruction, around the cities burned, the populations massacred, the civilizations disrupted. This is understandable because the destruction was real and its consequences were profound. But it misses the construction, the specific political and commercial achievement of the Pax Mongolica that was, in its own way, as extraordinary as the destruction that preceded it. The Mongols were the most creative destroyers in the history of the world. They built the first global economy while they were killing a tenth of the world's population. They transmitted the technologies that would transform European civilization while they were dismantling the civilizations that had developed those technologies. They created the commercial connectivity that would eventually lead to European global expansion while they were destroying the specific political framework that made that connectivity possible. They were, in the most precise sense, both the greatest curse and the greatest gift that the pre-modern world received from the steppe. If this story changed the way you think about globalization, about how the world was connected before the age of European expansion, about the relationship between political integration and commercial connectivity, and about the specific mechanisms through which the pre-modern world's first global economy was built and destroyed, subscribe. Every week we go deep on the economic forces and the political achievements and the specific catastrophes that shaped the world before the one we live in. Drop a comment below on whether you think the Black Death would have spread as widely without the Mongol trade routes. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.